The crew of the Radio Caroline pirate ship have been rescued as the boat threatened to capsize in stormy seas off Kent. The 6 were airlifted from the Ross Revenge after it ran aground on the Goodwin Sands near the East Goodwin lightship. They're recovering after being brought back to RAF Manston. The rescue helicopter had to hover close to a 100-foot mast as force 9 gales lashed the ship. The captain of the Ross Revenge radioed for help as the vessel drifted towards the Goodwins after losing its anchor. Tonight, the battle to save the Radio Caroline ship from breaking up. Good evening. Attempts are being made tonight to save the Radio Caroline ship, the Ross Revenge, which is in danger of breaking up off the Kent coast. The 1,000-ton trawler ran aground on the Goodwin Sands off Ramsgate last night. Since then, it's been battered by heavy seas. Early today, the crew of 6 were airlifted to safety. The RAF say they're lucky to be alive. David Forsdyke reports.
The 5 men and 1 woman crew from Radio Caroline. They were plucked in the nick of time from the decks of the converted trawler Ross Revenge, tonight still being pounded by seas off the East Kent coastline. The ship had been battered all night. The crew hadn't been aware that their anchor chain had been snapped. Around dawn, they realised that they'd been driven more than 15 miles south onto notorious sandbanks off Kent.
There was an enormous lurch. In fact, we were all thrown out of our beds and flung into the air. We realised immediately something was wrong. Got dressed. Everybody was on the bridge in their life jackets within about 2 minutes. We called the Coast Guard, and they informed us that we had actually run aground on the Goodwin Sands.
The survivors had stayed on board as long as possible to try to save the ship. Back on dry land, they had no illusions about how lucky they'd been.
We were basically praying for our lives because we knew that within a few minutes the whole thing would go into the water and basically we'd all be dead. We were very lucky the RAF showed up when they did.
Yes, I was going to say, if they'd come, say, a couple of minutes later, then we might not be here today.
The seas around the Ross Revenge were so rough that the Ramsgate lifeboat and its 7-man crew were thrown onto the sandbanks themselves as they attempted to take off the Caroline's crew. A major problem for the RAF rescue team was the huge mast on Caroline. As water poured into cabins and the ship began to roll, the aerials sliced through the air around the rescue helicopter.
And from our point of view upstairs, the boat rocking as it was doing on its beam with the 150-foot masts, it makes life a little bit tricky.
Caroline stopped transmitting in April after the 1990 Broadcasting Act, which threatened to jail anybody who worked for them. It was trying to become a legitimate satellite broadcaster. Those on board until this morning were caretakers waiting for the big break. Staff say the loss of the Revenge won't hamper their long-term plans. They say Caroline will be back. David Forsdyke, Coast to Coast, RAF Manston.
The salvage teams made an unsuccessful bid to free Radio Caroline from the Goodwin Sands. A tug has managed to secure a line to the 1,000-ton Ross Revenge, and another attempt will be made tonight. But now there's controversy over allegations that the salvage workers on board repelled a team from Radio Caroline who tried to regain control of the ship by boarding her from an inflatable dinghy. David Forsdyke reports.
Salvage workers aboard the Radio Caroline ship Ross Revenge today. Floundering on the Goodwins, the 1,000-ton ship ballasted with 200 tons of concrete to keep her steady at sea, she proved an impossible task. Still stuck and beached by one of the highest tides of the season. But as the salvage team worked with Dover lifeboat crews to secure lines, Caroline staff tried to regain possession of the Revenge. They hired this trawler to take them to the stranded ship. The Ramsgate skipper is an old friend.
I've been involved with Caroline quite a few years. It was to try and get something back, because, well, it stuck there on the sandbar and it was the first reasonable weather after the flood.
Caroline's representative, Peter Merthyr, now alleges that his bid to board his old ship was halted by salvors who threw a length of chain at him as he approached.
I'd gone out there at least to talk to somebody and certainly to try to get on board, and I didn't imagine that he would use it. I mean, it's a heavy lump of chain and obviously it could have caused injury. The next thing I knew, he'd thrown it at me.
Tonight, Dover Harbour Board deny the allegation that members of the tug crew on board the Ross Revenge used force to prevent the man from attempting to board the vessel, or that they threatened him with chains.
Our engineer independently decided to go out to see if he could assist on the salvage. But of course, legally, the vessel is in control of Dover Harbour Board at the moment, and it wasn't possible for him to go on board.
Possession of a stranded ship is a grey area. Salvage can depend on occupation and who has lines aboard. The part of the Dover lifeboat playing in helping to tie cables to the ship has met with surprise.
We saw the ropes being taken on board from one of the small lifeboats, the inflatable.
What's your impression of the RNLI's involvement?
Well, I think if it was up to the salvors, it's their job to obviously secure a rope to the ship, but not for the RNL to probably get involved.
Salvors will try around midnight tonight to attempt once again to free the Ross Revenge, leaving the argument over ownership until later. David Forsdyke, Coast to Coast, the Goodwin Sands.
A salvage team has made an unsuccessful bid to free the Radio Caroline ship from the Goodwin Sands. Another attempt will be made tonight. Meanwhile, there's a row over salvage rights for the Ross Revenge. A third attempt to rescue the stranded Radio Caroline ship has proved successful. The Ross Revenge had been grounded on the Goodwin Sands off the Kent coast for 2 days. Salvage crews pulled the boat from the sandbank on this morning's high tide, and 2 tugs are now taking it.
The Radio Caroline ship Ross Revenge is at Dover docks after being successfully salvaged from a sandbank. The vessel was recovered at the third attempt after being grounded on the Goodwin Sands off the Kent coast for 2 days. Salvage crews pulled the boat from the sandbank on this morning's high tide, and 2 tugs towed it to Dover. The Radio Caroline crew are negotiating with Dover Harbour Board over salvage rights.
Cost tens of thousands of pounds. Now the station manager wants to market the vessel as a tourist attraction to raise money.
She's a very famous radio station, very famous ship, and I think she'll make, in the short to medium term, quite a good publicity boost for the town of Dover.
The long-term plan is to get the Ross Revenge back out to sea and regain the broadcasting rights the station lost last year. Until then, its fans will have to do with watching rather than listening. Richard Brock, TVS News, Dover.
Hi, this is Robin Campbell from UB40. You're listening to Radio Caroline, 558 AM.
Well, I'd just like to say welcome back to Caroline. We are here to stay, and don't you forget it.
Whilst I do have this opportunity, I'd like to say a very big thank you to all those many people out there that have helped us during our recent difficulties, and just to let you know that it is very, very much appreciated by all of us out here.
3 decades of great music for Europe. This is Radio Caroline. Listening to Caroline 819, something now from John Waite's new band, Bad English.
But don't you agree, Peter, that I think to some extent you've paid your disc jockeys a slight disservice tonight by saying they couldn't recreate the Caroline thing on land? I think the last 2 weeks has proved that they can. And, I think to take this, the magic of Caroline must come from a ship to extremes is a bit unfair on the disc jockeys.
Well, fair or unfair, all I can say is that when Radio Caroline was on the air from the boat, I used to have it on all the time and used to enjoy listening to it. I've listened to the satellite programs for probably less than 1 hour altogether.
576. The legend lives on. This is Europe's musical heartbeat, Radio Caroline. 576. Caroline.
94.9 FM, 14:58 AM. This is the BBC station for London, Greater London Radio. It's exactly 9 o'clock.
6 people have been rescued from the former Radio Caroline ship, the Ross Revenge, which ran aground in heavy seas off Ramsgate. Peter Hunt reports.
The ship, the Ross Revenge, got into trouble at about 4 o'clock this morning. The 6 people on board the vessel, which is the home of the former pirate radio station, Radio Caroline, realised they were touching the bottom. An RAF rescue helicopter went to the scene, but the crew at first wanted to remain on board while it was towed to safety. But then it began to keel over on its side, and the 6 people were winched off.
A second attempt to refloat the former Radio Caroline ship will be made this morning. The Ross Revenge was washed up on a sandbank off Ramsgate early yesterday. A tug from Dover will try to get a line aboard at the next high tide at about 10 o'clock.
Na 8 jaar op zee te hebben gelegen, wordt de Ross Revenge op 22 november de haven van Dover binnengesleept. De scheepvaartinspectie bevindt het schip niet zeewaardig. En zolang de bergingskosten niet worden betaald, blijft het schip aan de ketting liggen.
Radio Caroline, loving awareness. Radio Caroline,
Love and good music, Radio Caroline. Love and good music, Radio Caroline. Radio Caroline. Caroline. 319 Caroline. All the hits on Caroline. The station we love. Love and good music, Radio Caroline. Caroline 319. Loving awareness, Caroline. Radio Caroline. Loving awareness, Caroline. Radio Caroline. Gonna make you feel so fine. Radio Caroline. Caroline. Radio Caroline. Loving awareness, Caroline. Good morning on Caroline. 319 Radio Caroline. Caroline on 319. The sound of the nation. Radio Caroline.
Ladies and gentlemen, more disco radio action from Radio Caroline.
You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you find that you do get what you need. If you listen to Radio Caroline, if you have been listening to Radio Caroline for the last 28 years, I think you will find that most of the time you have got just what you needed. And what people need is good music. The time is fast approaching 12 midday on this Easter Sunday. On 101.8, this is Radio Caroline from Dover. 2 minutes past 12 midday on this Easter Sunday. This is, of course, Radio Caroline on 101.8, coming to you live from the MV Ross Revenge, anchored here in the Granville Docks in Dover. We're 28 years old. A large multitude is rapidly assembling in the studio, and a bottle of wine, not wine, champagne, I should say. I always hate this bit, where you never know where the cork is going to end up. Is it going to go anywhere? Oh, yes, there we go.
Happy birthday, Caroline.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Paul Ryder there doing the honours. A man who always knows exactly what to do with a bottle.
Your station, Caroline.
Broadcasting again for the first time in more than 2 years. The station was closed after a raid at sea, but now the former pirate station is broadcasting once again from Dover, this time with a temporary licence. Radio station Radio Caroline says it's trapped in Dover Harbour because of government red tape. The operators want to move their ship, the Ross Revenge, to Chatham, but the Department of Transport won't let them. Philip Hornby explains.
This is Radio Caroline, testing on 101.4.
Caroline's back on the air, and it's legit, broadcasting to the Medway towns thanks to a temporary licence from the Radio Authority. But they're having to do it from Dover, beaming a signal that travels from the ship via Dover Castle, Brighton, Portsmouth, London and Maidstone. How much simpler it would be, they say, to tow the ship to the Medway and broadcast direct. Cheaper too. They pay Dover Harbour Board £1,000 a month just to stay here. Indeed, they had a temporary site lined up in this dry dock at Chatham's historic dockyard, but the Department of Transport say they can't go anywhere.
One suspects that they might be getting their own back for all the years that we sat out there, and they may have felt that we were sticking two fingers up to them or something. I don't know.
That's just not true, say the government. The ship needs a special safety certificate before it can be moved, a certificate that can only be granted by the country of its registration. And the problem is, where is the Ross Revenge registered?
A foreign registered ship must get permission from the flag state, and an English ship gets permission from the Department of Transport. We believe we're now an English ship. The Department of Transport are being ambivalent. They're not saying one thing or the other.
correspondence with people in Switzerland who say that they have a mortgage on the vessel.
So you're not convinced that it is an English ship?
We are not convinced that it's a UK or a British ship.
And so it's stalemate. But as the row goes on, the music goes on. Caroline broadcasting to Kent for the next 2 weeks and broadcasting across Europe on the Astra satellite. This is where they want to eventually end up, on the Medway. But not for the first time. Radio Caroline's ambitions are being thwarted by government officials. Philip Hornby, Coast to Coast.